Welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. We continue with our study of Acts and taking up the story of Paul defending himself after his rescue from the Jewish mob by the Roman cohort. Recall we left Paul last time with the Jewish mob dragging him from the Jerusalem temple during his purification, or the sequester period of that purification. The diaspora Jews charged him with defiling the temple and expect to kill, that is, under their law, stone him. But the strong Roman cohort nearby saved him in the nick of time. They now have him in custody. The mob is shouting, "Away with him," likely meaning remove him from the Jewish population and treat him at your will, likely also meaning to execute him. Now we will start Paul's defense before both the cohort and the Jewish crowd. The final 7 chapters of Acts are basically Paul defending himself and the faith. The first 5 speeches that he gives in these next chapters are related to his ministry and himself, and with narrative tying it all together by Luke. So let's start by reading a portion of that, starting in Acts 21, verse 37, and reading through chapter 22 to verse 21. Just as Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the tribune, "May I say something to you?" The tribune replied, "Do you know Greek? Then you are not the Egyptian who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness." Paul replied, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of an important city. I beg you, let me speak to the people." When he had given him permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the people for silence. And when there was a great hush, he addressed them in the Hebrew language, saying, "Brothers and fathers, listen to the defense that I now make before you." When they heard him addressing them in Hebrew, they became even more quiet. Then he said, "I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, educated strictly according to our ancestral laws, being zealous for God, just as all of you are today. I persecuted this way, up to the point of death, by binding both men and women and putting them in prison, as the high priest and the whole council of elders can testify about me. From them I also received letters to the brothers in Damascus, and I went there in order to bind those who were there and to bring them back to Jerusalem for punishment. While I was on my way and approaching Damascus, about noon, a great light from heaven suddenly shone about me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?' I answered, 'Who are you, Lord?' Then he said to me, 'I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting.' Now those who were with me saw the light, but did not hear the voice of the one who was speaking to me. I asked, 'What am I to do, Lord?' The Lord said to me, 'Get up and go to Damascus. There you will be told everything that has been assigned to you to do.' Since I could not see because of the brightness of that light, those who were with me took my hand and led me to Damascus. A certain Ananias, who was a devout man according to the law, and well spoken of by all the Jews living there, came to me, and standing beside me, he said, Brother Saul, regain your sight. And that very hour I regained my sight and saw him. Then he said, The God of our ancestor has chosen you to know his will, to see the righteous one, and to hear his own voice. For you will be his witness to all the world of what you have seen and heard. And now, why do you delay? Get up, be baptized, and have your sins washed away, calling on his name. After I had returned to Jerusalem, and while I was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance, and saw Jesus saying to me, Hurry and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. And I said, Lord, they themselves know that in every synagogue I imprisoned those who beat those who believed in you. And while the blood of your witness Stephen was shed, I myself was standing by, approving and keeping the coats of those who killed him. Then he said to me, Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. Well, as usual, Paul's writing is straightforward in many ways. The story there we know pretty well. But one scholar opens his commentary on these verses by the following. He says, in this writing, much is implied and assumes you know what is not written. Others note there are areas of awkward sentence structure in the Greek here, making it difficult at times to punctuate and assign pronouns properly. So when you read this in various translations, those pronouns shift as to who's saying what. Teaching scholars urge teachers and preachers to concentrate on the implied and assume to ensure better clarity. The message is clear if you do that, they say. That is done as we will teach it here. So we will comply, trying to mainly understand what it meant when written in order to better use it in our faith today, letting scriptural and scholarly advice, or the scholarly advice of Scripture, guide us in that process. For example, Luke assumes we know a Roman cohort was barracked, stationed, if you will, in the northwest corner of the temple grounds area, in what is called Fortress Antonio. That barracks had a raised, elevated staircase and platform, and that led directly to the front of that temple entrance, so they could observe what was going on and very quickly respond. These soldiers were on high alert for trouble during pilgrimage feast especially. So their response time was nearly immediate, as we saw here. A Roman cohort was a 1,000-man unit, normally made up of 760 infantry and 240 cavalrymen, plus the staff, small staff. It likely was fully staffed and may have been reinforced at this time of year. A tribune is the cohort commander, and under him are 10 centurions, each of which is commanding 100 men. And notice there in the scripture, it says the cohort, that the tribune brought centurions, plural. So there's a fairly good sized detail that moved in there immediately. Every decision that cohort, that centurion or that tribune especially makes is at the risk of his life. So he does not play games. He needs to get to the bottom of this. And in addition to being the commander, he also holds responsibility back to leadership of Rome. So he has a dual role, both as a military commander and, if you will, as a political commander, and is authorized to make decisions on the spot in the interest of Rome. He then has to make the decision, do I need to send it back further to get more people involved? That tribune seems to suspect Paul is an Egyptian Jewish leader of a zealot group that led Jews in revolt against Roman authority or rule, but had escaped their net. So when Paul speaks to him in Greek with his accent, etc., the commandant or tribune here realizes Paul is not whom he assumed Paul to be. The Greek in that exchange is awkward initially, so translations vary even as to who is speaking. An alternative is he, that is the tribune, asks Paul to speak in Greek so he can detect an Egyptian accent, which was very different from the Judean and Asian diaspora Jews. Josephus reports on this revolt in his History of the Jews, plus Luke referred to it back there in chapter 5, but didn't give us any details. Roman troops had dispersed them into the wilderness and killed many, but not all. That leader was also called, by the way, a false prophet / Messiah, according to Josephus. Of course, after all, the Jews expected their Messiah to be a military leader, to lead a revolt. That's not what Jesus was, but that's what they expected. And so therefore the Romans, their intelligence would have known this, and so that's what they're kind of looking for. The Romans are aware, most likely, that Paul has been teaching Jews and Gentiles to follow Jesus, the Messiah or King. That in itself, of course, has them of interest to some extent. Paul opens his remarks, when permitted to the Jews, with brothers and fathers. Brother as a fellow Jew, he's addressing them, and fathers to their leaders. Scholars note many Christians are upset at this point when he does not say, I am a Christian. And so scholars spend a good bit of time on that point and say it's a significant point for us to ponder. Paul is placing himself here in his proper ethnic group, first of all, which is his religion also. Dr. Eugene Boring, emeritus professor at the Wright School of Divinity there at Texas Christian University, and, by the way, a longtime disciples minister, provides the following. Paul places himself within Judaism, which is proper. He notes that it's very important for we modern Christians to understand that at the time Christianity, the way as it's called here by Paul, was a sect within Judaism and not an individual religion. Luke is likely protecting that point here and reinforcing it for Theophilus, which is whom he writes this book to. That the Christian sect, the way, if you will, should be regarded by Rome as within Judaism. It is not a separate and independent faith at this time. For one reason, Roman law would not allow such at this time. That changed over the next 200 years but is not the situation during the time of this event is supposedly happened. When Judaism was critical to the Christians, within Judaism, Christianity staying within Judaism was critical to Christianity's survival at that time. And what is taught was well within, being taught by Christians at the time, was well within Judaism. That is the core gospel. Okay? But what this crowd has raised, or these people, is this charge of what he's requiring, or he's claimed to have required, or allowed the Jews that are in that religion to do. Not what the Gentiles are allowed, what the Jewish Christians are allowed to do. They say that understanding was critical. Receive for the Jews, for Christianity to remain in Judaism was critical to its own survival, and the scholars say we Christians today need to understand that. In time and place, they're not writing. This is not a story about what it is today. It's a story about what it was in the 50s AD. Tolerance and protection from Rome was granted to the Jewish religion only, not to splinter groups, not to new faiths. Had laws to actually prevent that from happening. And those laws carried the death penalty. He notes this exemption will become more and more difficult for the sect to sustain as it becomes more and more a Gentile religion. Paul is in a perfect situation in his crisis to be making that point here, indirectly. I am a Jew from Tarsus, meaning also I am here on pilgrimage to celebrate the holy days. I belong here is implied. I am in compliance with Judaism. That's why I'm here. Before Paul's defense ends, he has made it clear he is a Jew and from an important Roman city. He also is making it clear he holds to the Jewish teachings while he is obedient to Jesus the Messiah or Christ as his Lord. So far, he has said nothing that should justify a disruption of this Jewish society, which is seeking his death and nearly succeeded. So there's obviously a lot more to this story, scholars say, that Luke has here that he's trying to imply. But it's like a lot of things that's written kind of in code. You can't say everything out there if you're under the microscope of Romans, which would like to get rid of you to start with. Dr. Matthew Skinner, in his commentary, concludes, Paul wants to speak to this Jewish mob crowd now that he is safe in hands, implying that because he believes, that is, Paul himself believes, he can bring them to a peaceful mode with his ability of rhetoric and the fact that he has such a strong foundation in Judaism. Being trained at the foot of Gamaliel has meaning he was there as a child, not just during his bar mitzvah, but as a child. The children sat at the foot. So he's been in this culture. He's a Nazarite, the most devout of those people. He was a Pharisee. Clearly they seem to respond and settle probably when he strikes the standard pose of an orator in those days, raises his hands and gestures for peace, and many would add, even though he's in chains, and because he's in chains, many scholars would add most likely that ruler, the Roman commander, made some sort of signal for them to obey. His decision to speak to them in Aramaic Hebrew was a common language of the Jews at that time and was what was used at the temple. Roman commander over the Jews likely signaled, again, as I said, for them to be quiet, and that furthermore, that I have authorized him to speak, letting the Jews know Rome's in charge. Romans had to step in, even though we're in Judean land, under Judean rule. When Rome steps in like this, the Roman tribune is in charge. Scholars note Paul is bearing witness to his past and to Jesus Christ. He is not directly refuting the opposition's charge against him. He leaves that for them to decide once they hear his story. He is making it fit into doing Jewish missionary work, and that he is doing midrash at this point, bringing it out there, describing his story, laying it out there. Then you, as a Jew, make the decision. And basically implied in this, of course, that what he's been teaching is in the presence of both Gentiles and Jews. He's in the area where they live in close association, and the faith is being offered for proselytization, if you will. And, of course, what he claims he's been teaching and this concept of going to the world was Jesus' hope, notes Dr. Skinner. This points out that he was schooled by the scholar Gamaliel, a very zealous teacher, with a very respected reputation. He makes the point he was equally zealous of the law and God as all of you are, letting them know, despite them in the middle of this rite, they're being zealous to their God. He's not saying you're not, and cites this percussion of or this persecution of the way, his past of doing that, as what he thought was the right thing to do at the time. But he learned that was a mistake only when Christ interceded on the Damascus road to open his mind to see that who Jesus actually was. And then he became obedient to that. Paul gives this story 3 times in Acts, and there are variations in the 3 stories. Some people get lost in those differences, but the scholars generally say that the variations that are there seem to be consistent with telling it for whatever audience is there and reason that's there at the time. They urge us to focus on each story at the time to better interpret the rhetoric's aim as it's being used. A point in verse 17 through 21 is unique to the current version of that story only, and it's only found there in Acts. While in a trance, Jesus ordered him to leave Jerusalem. Paul says he argued with Jesus that his zealous past will lead to an issue of Jewish trust. But Jesus does not agree and sends him to witness. He doesn't necessarily agree with that, but he does send him to witness to the Gentiles at some later point. Dr. Beverly Robert Gaventa notes in her commentary, or her comments on this, that the climax here of Paul's speech, he is telling this audience, I am obeying Jesus now. Okay? And he told me that Jerusalem Jews would reject my testimony. So I went away to the Gentiles with my witnessing to Jesus Christ. This is putting it out there, she says, on the table, letting it wiggle. Let the Jews resolve their interpretation of it. rather than him trying to give some sort of alternative interpretation. And yet, but he's doing it while he's got, at least temporary, the security of Rome between him and that Jewish right. I hope this gives you some ideas where the scholars look at this, or things that they suggest we seriously consider as we read this and ponder it. Hope you have a good Bible study, and we'll continue in this in future lessons.